Got the designer at the end, okay?
Right.
Quick getaway.
Welcome and thanks for coming to the Future of the Edge City. My name is Jay Cross, as Chris pointed out. I'm with Howard Hughes. And one of the things we're going to talk about today, which is a little different than I think some of the other panels, most of the other panels have been focused on fixing things. Reinventing New York, decarbonizing buildings, reinventing public space, repurposing infrastructure, double aging of people and buildings. But we'd like to talk about an aspect of the modern metropolis that actually I think is working remarkably well. And that's the Edge City. Places like Columbia, Maryland, which is one of our projects, the Woodlands in Texas, or Summerlin in Nevada, or others like New Rochelle right here adjacent to New York City, Carmel in Indiana. These places are all circa about 100,000 people. And I think that's kind of the way in which we tend to think of an edge city. 100,000 people, tens of thousands of acres. And our panel is not made up of a bunch of experts on planning. There's a developer like me, of course. We're blamed for basically all of society's ills. And so to help rehabilitate me, I've got a great panel of super observant critic and author Paul Goldberger and renowned designer Thomas Heatherwick. So welcome to you both. I was going to start with some observations just to kind of set the table. All three of our master plan communities today are seeing residential, retail, and office growth completely outpacing the adjacent metropolitan regions of Baltimore, Houston, or Las Vegas. Retail is back to pre-COVID rates, pre-COVID occupancy. Office space is being leased at better rates than pre-COVID. We continue to sell finished lots to home builders, and we're building multifamily apartments as fast as we can get them out of the ground. So why is that? We're starting to hear anecdotally that many young people are moving back to where they grew up. So they might have grown up in Columbia, might have grown up in the Woodlands, and they're moving back in a post-COVID world. And one of the things that just helps explain that a little bit is when you think about these master plan communities, in particular in the case of Columbia and the Woodlands, there were two visionary developers, Jim Rouse and George Mitchell. And they started with an idea that they can do something that's better than what was the then normal suburbanization of America. So if you recall, in the baby boomer generation started to think about where they wanted to live, they all went to the suburbs, and it's just vast amounts of tract housing. In the case of Mitchell and Rouse, they thought there has to be something more to it than that. It has to have an idea. In the case of Jim Rouse, it was based on inclusiveness. I want to build a town for 100,000 people. Surely I can do it better than Baltimore's doing it. This is back in the late 60s. And I want to have it be the same town for the CEO to the janitor. In the case of George Mitchell, who was an oil man from Texas, he was upset about the way in which Houston was expanding, and he wanted to have a place where nature was the dominant idea. So he designed a city in the trees, which is the Woodlands today. And when you drive down the main boulevards of the Woodlands, there's a 20 to 30 foot landscape buffer on every arterial road, no retail signage on the streets. And for years and years, nobody would lease retail space from him because he wouldn't allow them to put up signs. But that idea stuck over time. And so now here we are 50 years later, and we're trying to solve for a similar issue. The millennial generation is actually bigger than the boomer generation. And they're now having kids, and they need to work from home. They want to be near good schools. They want to be in safe communities. And they look to these master plan communities where they might have grown up and says, it has everything I need. And so we think that with the benefit of this sort of 50-year cycle, it's very interesting that here we are sort of rethinking it again today, and rethinking in terms of what needs to go into it. It's about a lot more than the office space or the retail space or the housing. It's all the other little things that go in between. The Woodlands, for instance, has 30 schools, 30 places of worship, 5 hospitals, 6 golf courses. I mean, it's really 5 million square feet of office space. These towns are now fully developed and increasingly becoming more intensified. There's virtually no zoning in these towns. There's no city government. They're unincorporated townships within counties. They're like basically one big giant homeowners association. And as a result, the towns develop generically. They develop along the lines of what the people in the town want to see happen. And we, as the master developer, really are stewards for the homeowners. as we move forward. So, Paul, I'm going to start with you.
Sure.
You're working on a book called The Imperfect City.
I am.
And you told me out in the hallway
Right.
you're going to be a bit of a shit disturber, and so say
Okay.
that our cities are too perfect. But let me throw it out to you. Like, how
Sure.
do you think the imperfect city relates to these master plan communities?
Well, no, Jay, it's a great question. The thesis of this book, whenever I finally write it, which is a few years' work probably, it's sometimes quicker to build a building than write a book, is that in fact some of the best things about cities are those things that just rise up organically and naturally, even if they're a little bit messy, you know, even if they're not exactly what we want. I mean, when you talked about the developer or the conceiver of Woodlands as not allowing any kind of retail signage, my first thought was, you know, when a place is that perfect, it's kind of wrong in a certain way, and that you want something that suggests a little bit of authenticity and life and energy and spontaneity, and not a world of absolute perfection, I think. And so I think the challenge is how do you kind of navigate between the goal of a master plan, which is a certain kind of ideal city, and the reality that life is a little bit messy and it's okay for a place to reflect that. Because also people are different, people are complicated, people change, people's needs change, people's desires and wants change. And you know, what may be right in one year is not necessarily right for another, and populations evolve, tastes evolve, lots of things change. And so I think a great city has to be somewhat malleable, and a master plan has to have some room in it, of some give, really. You're absolutely right that those are two places, Columbia and the Woodlands, that started out with kind of ideal conceptions behind them. Summerlin, though, is really very different. I mean, Summerlin is really much more just a beneficiary of the, you know, explosive economic growth and power of Las Vegas, really.
Yeah, that's fair. Yep.
That it had to go somewhere, and thankfully, it's going into a place where someone's at least paying a little bit of attention to all the issues that matter.
Yeah, in Summerlin's case, we had to really go back after the first 20 years and start to rethink how are we going to form a downtown.
Right.
We have a minor league ballpark there. And
Nothing better
all
to build
started
a
to come
downtown around
together.
than a ballpark.
Right, exactly. Stadiums belong in cities.
I wish we'd put City Field in Hudson Yards, but that's another discussion.
Well, we came damn close.
I know.
Let's say, Thomas, I'm going to flip it back to you now. You and I have had this conversation recently that you're working with us in Columbia, which we're excited about. And your recent TED Talk was about putting love back into buildings. And this morning, I think you were speaking of putting emotion back into cities. And you and I have talked a lot about, you know, a place has to have an idea. And so based on what you've seen in Columbia, do you think we're getting close to an idea, or how do we put ideas in place that sort of start to germinate and resonate for decades?
Yeah, I mean, for years, I feel like in the world of architecture and design, I've gone to conferences like this, and you've watched as someone shows a master plan and some zoning and about how many schools and and it's still bland as anything. And kind of, I virtually know no new places where the whole place is new and that it isn't bland. And you can say, oh no, it's successful because there's a community group there and this is the artisanal coffee over there. But the spectacular success of blandness in everything new is just unbelievable. I mean, it's like we've revolutionized architecture in being able to build that blandly. And so I think what's really interesting is that we all have the illusion we're special. I think everyone in this room, unless you're clinically depressed, thinks that you are special in some way. And I love those statistics, you know, when you sort of work out, I think, which university professors think they're an average professor, above average. Yeah, 94% of professors say they're above average.
Above average, exactly.
So we all have that illusion, and it's really important actually to keep that illusion. in some sense. And it amazes me that places need to have an idea. You listen to what people talk about. They're always talking about eccentric things. They say, oh, last weekend my friend did this mad thing. The most unmanned, mad-seeming people are always describing madnesses, because that's actually what we respond to, and that's what you respond into in people.
Yes,
and
yes.
I just think we are so unconfident to design madness into places. And I've never been to Austin, but I loved that slogan, keep Austin weird. Now, I think the idea that you're self-consciously trying to make things weird isn't quite right.
Right.
But I think you should.
And it's in the process of making yourself bland.
But if in
Bland,
doubt,
right.
But if in doubt, be weird. Because, and so, you think of the places that are most loved in the world, really loved. And so if I imagine trying to propose to anyone, like, why don't we do a city where there's no roads or streets and there's just water? People would just say, you're mad. But that's the most loved city on the
world.
planet.
Right.
Has got a ludicrous proposition.
Right.
And it feels like you need to have a proposition that drives somewhere. And I think, in the UK we have Milton Keynes, which is the same age as me. And it's so square.
You're looking better.
What I liked, it was the 100% square. Like, we are so square. Every bin, and they have these porte cocheres, which are these sort of entry, sort of porchy bits that stick out, and they all have to have them. And so you're sort of splendidly something. And I just think it's interesting because I believe in diversity as well. And that we have, at the moment, if you get 100 artists and lay their work out, it would be amazing. You'd look at 100 different types of work. If you get 100 architecture practices, lay out the work, it probably will look like the same firm did it all. And so it's kind of, how do you really get architectural diversity when you're going to do that? But and in Hong Kong, I'm just thinking about the Happy Valley. Well, one, that's just a great name. It's ridiculous. But then in the middle of Happy Valley is just a race course, a horse racing course. And it's just like so inefficient use of land. And then there's all these towers all looking at horse racing, and it's just bonkers. But it's got a personality, and I live in that place. And I think that there's been the modern movement has been so po-faced and self-serious. And I think places need to have that confidence. And I actually think the public, we all want places to have the guts to have an idea. And we'll kind of go with that and give it the benefit of the doubt. And certainly messiness is the places we love. Le Corbusier was so wrong. He did some great buildings, but he was so wrong.
His urbanism was
cities.
absolutely the
So
worst
wrong.
ever. Right.
So rude to our actual humanity in what he was, like, crime against humanity if he'd been allowed to do everything he wanted to do.
Part of the problem, I think, is that the users don't have the expectations that we do. So, we just opened, in Texas, they have these things called the Ice House, which is where you go to get beer. So we opened one in the Woodlands, the longest bar in Texas.
Okay.
But it's all perfect metal, perfect, AstroTurf, and it's too perfect.
It's too perfect.
Like,
it's too perfect. I think we're both saying we're all saying the same thing. Exactly.
And it's a real challenge because it just doesn't come naturally to even the builders.
It's too flat.
Let alone the users.
It's too flat, too smooth, too shiny.
Yeah.
And cladding. Everything. The world's got covered in cladding.
Yeah.
I think most of the buildings we love aren't covered in this kind of fake stuff all over it. I imagine a big hurricane coming, just blowing it all off, but that would probably kill people, so it's not a good thing. But it's just the confidence. I find it funny that in our team, we've got 220 architects and designers. Snagging, I guess everyone in the room knows what snagging is, and snagging, the kind of checking whether what's built is as per the drawings and perfect. And my team can snag something the newest team member can snag something to within a tolerance of microns and they'll get it perfect. But you go to the places we love, my God, the wall's out by about
Yeah, exactly.
3 foot.
Yeah, yeah.
And the
door
surface
won't
is
close.
stained and imperfect. And so we are scared to be raw. We're really scared. And it's hard to kind of quantify that. We can only quantify a sort of version of perfection. And so we end up with these tolerances of plus or minus 3 millimeters. And it's kind of, can we have the confidence? Because surely it should be cheaper to build rough. And our university building was one of the chances we had to be really rough. And we didn't have to sell anything to anyone. And so it's full of bubbles and stones and imperfect concrete. And the fetishization of perfection, I think, is wrong. Actually, the places we love are full of imperfection. And so how do we build that?
That's the very point I was trying to make, I think. Yes, yes.
So the building, not just the imperfection of that building is a bit different to that, but actually the building itself being having complexity when you're closer to it. And I think most new buildings have no complexity. You just look at it and go, I don't never need to look at this again. I'll sketch it for you now. Whereas the things that you like, you can't, they've got something infinite about them. And good imperfection is kind of infinite in some way.
Now, can you do it at a level of scale? So it's not great to have a 350-unit apartment building that's kind of wobbly, right?
Well-
but you can do a retail complex
Well,
that's timber.
wobbly's carrying the idea of imperfection a little too far, I think. Isn't it? But when you talk about scale, Jay, I think that's actually key to the whole point, because I think there are a couple of different issues there. One of them is the nature of global capital and global finance and the pressure to greater and greater scale and bigger things, I think has impacted a lot on how people perceive places today. But there's also the scale of development, and we shouldn't say this with a developer, particularly a developer who's one of the more enlightened developers in the country, but in fact, it's very difficult for a large corporate entity to create a system that allows for the sort of things that Thomas is talking about and that I'm talking about. I mean, it's just sort of inherently inconsistent with the structure by which we build things now.
Well, it's actually not that inconsistent. I actually push our team to make buildings smaller.
Good.
So I think we're going into a smaller building universe.
I've been pushed by him to make our building smaller.
Exactly.
Good. We'll all keep pushing. Okay.
That's true.
But also,
a 100,000-foot building's a big building.
Right,
And we
right,
don't need
right.
a 200,000-foot building. And we certainly don't need million-square-foot buildings unless you're building Google's campus. But I mean, it's
But
like,
I think not enough thinking is done about the public spaces as rooms. And I think Jan Gehl speaks well about this. Jane Jacobs speaks well about this, Christopher Alexander. But that I think we just tend to, there's been this falling in love with the outside is following the inside somehow, and that's honest and true and all of these things. But that when you think about an apartment, and in 20 years, how many people will go into that apartment in a vaguely urban area? Maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000. But how many people that will be the landscape of part of their life? Could be 20 million. But the thing driving it is the selling of that apartment, so the choices inside. And so it feels like the public isn't represented enough in the place that they make. Just as on an aside about, I was at something where there was someone talking about artificial reefs, and how do you help a natural reef to grow with a starter? And the main thing was about texture, making these elements that you put into the sea full of texture that the corals can grow onto it. And it felt to me, that's what we're like. Humans don't like big open spaces. They back against things, and textures of buildings we cling to and grow. And I think that the flatness and shininess has stopped us kind of like corals clinging and making streets and places be alive. And coming back to Columbia, I think where we're focusing on the center of the city, it feels one of our jobs is to make it sticky and raw and rough to make people feel comfortable, because I think it's called thigmatic, that humans are thigmatic. We don't like being in the middle of huge open spaces. we tend to gravitate to edges. So edges need to be well designed.
There's another reason I like your analogy, or you're raising coral, actually, because I think cities themselves have to grow in a certain organic, natural way, and by agglomeration, and by, nobody designs the shape of coral, right? It sort of happens. And I think that's where even the very best master plan is at odds with reality. So finding ways to be open to natural growth, even if it isn't exactly ideal, I think it will ultimately have a sense of authenticity that people value and are more comfortable.
And I think that going back to your edge cities, I think in the UK, we've, unlike in the US or in Germany or something like, we've got one main dominant alpha monkey city. Is it a monkey? Can't remember. Alpha, whichever one. That's the main.
Right.
And then that sort of utterly dominates. And after COVID, now when people have realized they don't have to be in a headlock of that city, what there hasn't been, the level of ambition, the culture, putting real ambition into places other than main capital cities.
Right,
the main,
right, exactly.
Has not been, but you've got much more agility if you're working in making edge cities to have an idea, put it in there, and do something with it, which would be so much harder in more major cities
Agreed.
to do, and then real love follow that.
The real problem with the edge city is not the car. We actually, there's more people commute into our master plan communities than commute out of it.
Really?
So
Is that true of both places,
Yes,
both
they've
Woodlands
both
and?
been pre-certified by LEED as a LEED community because we actually don't create so many car trips for such a long period of time. The problem is, it's the parking planners. Because you build retail, 5 cars per 1,000 square feet. I'm going to build a
Parking minimums are one of the
I'm going to build an
great-
office, 3
I think-
per 1,000. And meanwhile, you got office
right.
buildings that are 60% occupied,
Right.
and they won't let you double count. So when you come
Right.
do your coral thing, it's like,
Yeah, right,
who
right.
cares about the Whole Foods parking guy versus
Right,
the
right,
office
right,
parking
right,
guy
right.
versus the.
I think we can state unequivocally that parking minimums are actually one of the great enemies of good urban planning and urban design.
I agree, wholeheartedly. Yeah.
So, simple as that. Yes.
Let people fight for the parking.
So,
That's what makes cities work.
Yeah.
Half of going around a block in New York City is looking for a parking spot. Like it's part of what makes.
well,
the
but
place.
also, yeah, right. You shouldn't be in the car, but it's in New York City. In the Woodlands, yes, but not in New York
okay.
City. But what about the street in a place like the Woodlands?
Well, that's
how
another problem.
pedestrian oriented is it? Because ultimately, I think another factor is that we've all learned is that whatever the street, whatever the city rather, whether it's a city on the scale of London or New York, or a place like Columbia or the Woodlands or any place else, making the city inviting and comfortable and stimulating
Yeah.
people walking.
So
and
there's two
incentivizing you
issues.
to
There's-
walk
there's
means
two-
a lot.
Right, exactly. So we have in all of our communities trails, 200 miles of trails.
Right.
So that's walking, biking, hiking.
Right.
The problem is that when you get into what are our town centers, we don't sort of intensify that whole notion.
Okay.
And so we say, oh, we'll put a multifamily there, we'll put an office building over there, we'll do some retail. And what we're trying to focus on, no, it's all got to be in here. It's gotta
You
be-
got to pull it
you gotta be
together.
able to walk across the
Right,
street.
right.
And the parking, both the traffic planners 50 years ago, forced us into 4 and 6 lane roads.
Right.
And they're just
They're wrong.
They're
Yeah,
a
right,
nightmare.
right.
Right.
They're
And
a
so we're
night-
trying to steal lanes back.
Good.
And widen sidewalks. And
Good.
There's just
All right.
like we've had 50 years of kind of the wrong approach to infrastructure.
Right.
Either neglecting it or building
The wrong stuff.
building the wrong way.
Right.
And that's the challenge going forward. That, and I think the other one we're wrestling with a little bit is how to bring culture. You want to avoid the Truman Show effect.
Yeah, right.
which I
Exactly.
totally
That's
agree
sort of
with
what
you.
we've both been saying.
Yeah, and a lot of that is taking chances with the retailers, taking chances with the food and beverage outlets. Don't care whether they got good credit rating. If it's a great concept, you want them. You got to keep piling things, as Thomas says, layering things on top of it. So what we're trying to do, and we're trying to make sure that the multifamily is right next door to the office building, which is right next door to 5 restaurants, and you're going to walk down.
Right.
We're actually in Columbia. We're trying to create a high street, big bold ambition, but
No, but I think that it's the right ambition.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because I think, in a way, the more interesting question is not how do you create a master plan, but how do you retrofit places that
Right.
were idealistic, but nevertheless built on a physical layout, an arrangement and plan that so prioritized the automobile
Correct.
over other things. And now how do we manage to hold on to what's attractive and good about those places, but make them more right for the world we want to live in now?
Yeah.
One of the things that I really loved was Jim Rouse, the founder of Columbia. One of his main things was he said, "A city is a garden for growing people." And in that way, he was making a city for inclusion where everyone, at a time when there was still Jim Crow laws and things like that.
The redlining, like exactly. If you were a builder that redlined or a bank that redlined, you weren't allowed into Columbia. Just like flat out. Not,
Oh, I mean,
It was-
I think
he was really visionary.
Jim Rouse was
Yeah.
one of the most extraordinary developers who's
Yeah.
ever lived, I think.
Yeah.
Actually.
But I think how can you get Burning Man is a city,
Yeah.
a city of 80, 90,000 people, where that's a pretty weird city. But it's kind of got a manifesto driving it somehow. And the loyalty to that people have is massive. And so how can you have a manifesto for a settlement, for new settlements that are growing, that you can really have the original founders? And when we did some work in Milton Keynes in the UK, there were a few of those original guys who had been in their 20s making this idealistic place, who were so excited by the potential socially of what they were doing. And they did make a good place. People love it. And I think just to make sure there's always that kind of dream and idealism and something, I come back to it, but it's an idea, a real ludicrous idea that everyone can
Okay,
attach
so on that
themselves to.
happy note, we're running out of time. You're going to help us write the manifesto for Phoenix, 37,000 acres.
Okay.
Phoenix.
Yeah, we're
Is that your
scared out of our
Is
mind.
that your next project?
Yeah, exactly. So
But we could,
You're going to save Phoenix.
but if we
Okay,
can
good.
have a conversation with the people who might be the first people who live there and grow it with them and extract their madness
right.
and
Yep.
say, come on, let's do it.
Density, density, and density. Never mind location, location,
No,
and
no, that's
location.
gone.
It's
That's-
density, density, and density.
So I hope you'll all agree that being a moderator with these two is a pretty easy job. And so I want to thank both Paul and Thomas for hopefully making for a good session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.